Let's work through lesson 5 in our history. This should be, well, you will have probably seen and read part of this if you did last week's Khan Academy assignment. I wanted to come back and kind of reiterate some things from the reading that you did last week. We've been discussing the age of industry. And so what we've begun to see throughout our study of history is that as the age of industry, it really begins to change almost all of American life. It genuinely created a whole new kind of society, what we would call an urbanized society. Excuse me. People are up until this point, the majority of Americans were living on farms. They were, sustaining themselves. And as we see this in industry grow, factories beginning to grow, and cities begin to grow, by thousands, people are leaving their farms and leaving the countryside and moving into cities, and really wanting to be a part of this America's industrial prosperity, this growth that's happening, and the excitement that's in the air, and genuinely changes the face of what the American people's lives look like. Not everyone was a big fan of it. There's an author whose name is Mark Twain, and if you've been around here, you've read some things written by Mark Twain, but he called it the Gilded Age. There were certain people, and you see this if you read any historical accounts of pretty much anything, as prosperity hits, an obsession sort of hits sometimes for the material things. And Mark Twain called this the Gilded Age. He felt that prosperity of the era was actually covering up this massive amount of corruption in politics and in society. This term, to gild something, is the action of taking something that's really actually cheap and sort of covering it up with gold to make it appear to be wealthy, or to be not wealthy, to appear to be valuable. And what you have is a gilded item. And so he was saying that all of the corruption and all of the spiritual turmoil that's happening, that all of the outside prosperity was just a gold covering to make it look good, but in reality it was cheap and useless. The reality is most Americans didn't agree with him. So that's sort of up to our own interpretation as we go along. All right, let's spend a few minutes talking about immigration, because this time period in the late 19th century, immigration kind of skyrocketed. Between 1815 and 1865, about 6 million immigrants entered the United States. Between 1866 and 1915, about 25 million came. So it was huge. And in many ways, the industrial age directly affected the flow of immigration. Couple of things. Number one, the development of better steamships made travel across the ocean much faster and much safer. And then, as multiple companies begin to produce and use steamships, because of the competition, it forces prices down. If there's only one option, they can charge as much as they want. If I have two companies competing against each other, it sort of helps balance out costs. So faster and safer travel, and then less expensive travel. The idea of the having employment through all of these factories, and this dream of having better lives for these families, really encourage immigration during this time period. Now, if we remember correctly, if we kind of go back for a minute, when we built the railroads, you have the Central Pacific Railroad began to hire Chinese labor, because they worked harder, they worked faster, they worked better, and they typically worked cheaper than a lot of the Americans who were here. And so we ended up with a large amount of Chinese immigrants coming in that we were hiring as Americans to build the railroads. And what happened is, as the Chinese immigrants continued to enter the country, kind of through the next decade, there were some factory workers who began to fear that they were going to lose their jobs. So honestly, what happened was, people began to be concerned that they were going to lose their jobs to these hardworking Chinese immigrants. They were willing to work for lower wages. So competition for jobs honestly made some Westerners began to have very negative feelings toward Chinese immigrants. People began to blame them for everything that was happening. The evils of society that were happening were being blamed on these Chinese immigrants. And so before 1882, entrance into the United States was almost unrestricted, except for a couple of like convicts and maybe prostitutes who were trying to come in. They would not be allowed to come in. Other than that, it was relatively easy to come in as an immigrant to the United States. However, in 1882, Congress adopted this thing called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred laborers from entering the United States for 10 years. So basically, the Chinese Exclusion Act stopped Chinese immigrants coming in for a total of 10 years. In 1882, also, the Congress barred immigration of the insane and other individuals likely to become public charges. So this Chinese Exclusion Act pauses the immigration that we had built because we were hiring them because they were cheap labor. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I will lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is the quote that is on the Statue of Liberty. And that the statue has welcomed millions of immigrants into America since 1886. It's located on Liberty Island in New York Harbor. It's a copper statue, and it really stands as a monument to the liberties, the freedoms. That's why it's called the Statue of Liberty. Represents all those liberties, those freedoms that Americans enjoy under our unique form of government. The statue was given to us by France. It was designed by a man named Frederick A. Bartholdi, I believe is his last name. The cost was covered by donations of the people of France. The pedestal that it's on was built with donations from the American people. So the pedestal was paid for by donations of Americans. The statue itself was paid for by the French. She holds a torch, which is 305 feet above the base of the pedestal. Her left arm holds a tablet. It has the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then at her feet, which are kind of hard to see, are this shackles that are broken to represent the broken shackles of tyranny. And that poem that I just read was engraved and put on the pedestal in 1903. And you probably already know this, but it was not green. It was copper, like a penny, but left out in the elements, it has turned green. Okay, as immigration grows and cities begin to get larger and larger, we have a lot of challenges that begins to happen. The rapid growth or the rapid expansion of the industrial cities create housing issues. Housing was scarce and a lot of times of really poor quality. To meet the demand for housing for industrial workers, builders began to build apartment buildings. And they were built in such a way that they were really being able to use every inch of space on a lot. Apartments were teeny tiny, buildings were cramped close together. These crowded living conditions, and honestly, a lot of this has to do with the lack of knowledge. There was not a real understanding of good health practices And therefore, because of so many people crammed into such a small space, you end up with a rapid spread of disease, which you really see that in and out of history a lot of times in a lot of places. Sewer and sanitation systems were almost always inadequate to meet the needs of this many people in an area. And we all know if sewage or just sanitation, things that should be taken out and gotten rid of, remain, you're going to have bugs, you're going to have rodents, you're going to have diseases spreading. Food was not food, that's not the right word at all. Because wood was the primary building source, you end up with fire issues. And we have this thing called the Great Chicago Fire. It happened in 1871. And there's no for sure written article or primary source as to what happened. Supposedly, and most historians I think would agree with this, that there was a lady named Mrs. Patrick O'Leary, and if you notice, that's an Irish name, who would have been an Irish immigrant, and it just so happens they blamed this on this Irish immigrant family. Supposedly, she left a lantern, which would have been lit with a flame, burning in her barn, and supposedly her cow knocked it over, caught the barn on fire, and before long ravaged the city. I don't really remember the percentage of the city that was burned, but it was a very bad thing. You know, when you have all of these wooden structures so close together, filled with bedding and clothing and blankets and curtains, then you end up with a perfect situation for a fire, and it just wiped out a whole section of Chicago. A really cool thing that came out of this time period were these things called settlement houses. And there really were people who were trying to better the society around them for others. The reality is we have the same issues with inner cities today, and we sort of have the same ideas happening, but basically this group of caring people were trying to bring about changes in the inner cities for these families who needed it, and they began to provide what were called settlement houses. Basically, this is where local residents could come and get help and training to learn how to better care for their families. One of the earliest and best known settlement houses was founded by a lady named Jane Addams. She was born into a wealthy family, but really began to show this massive concern for the poor, which honestly in that time period didn't always happen. She purchased what's called the Hull House. It was an old mansion right in the center of Chicago's slum district, like the worst area. It started in 1889 as a daycare, so mothers could drop their children off in a safe place being taken care of while they went to work. Eventually, they began to offer a wide variety of programs. They were teaching, educating them on health practices, teaching them how to sew and how to learn different trades. And then they began to work outside of their house and began to promote the founding of parks in these areas and recreational areas in these industrial centers. And it really did become sort of this model for all of these other places that built upon this idea to help people in this kind of impoverished lifestyle. We have this idea of what we would consider more modern cities begin to emerge during this time period. As the age of industry begins to progress, with the constant flow of industry and technological advancements, American cities begin to sort of really take on the characteristics that we see in the 20th century. They're becoming more attractive cities. The city life becomes more pleasant and more efficient, really. One big thing was an improved transportation system. Before the Civil War, mass transit in American cities was by horse railway. An omnibus was basically a horse-drawn coach. We end up with in New York, for example, in 1870, they began to use this, what we call an elevated steam railway, where passengers carried passengers above crowded streets So we have the subway come into play. We have the electric trolley car come into play, which runs on a track. It's sort of pushed forward by this connection to electric wires that are stretching above the cities. The Brooklyn Bridge is built. We have skyscrapers. The guy named Louis Sullivan, known as the father of the modern skyscraper, builds the first skyscraper. It was only 29, I say only, it was 29 stories high, which in this time period was a pretty massive deal. And so what we would picture more modern cities in all of these aspects begin to become pretty predominant. So the late 19th century saw this very large increase in the number of industrial workers. So 1860, there were about a little under 3 million people working in this industrial area. By 1900, excuse me, so 40 years later, 13 million people are working in this area. Now, the reality is the advancements in industrialization began to create better benefits for the working man. Therefore, more people are working. Many of those like back-breaking, really physically hard tasks were becoming eliminated by new machinery. The workday was becoming shorter. It had gone from 11 hours to an average of a little less than 10 hours. But during this time period, we have this rise of what we call labor organizations, and we're not going to get into a whole bunch of details. This is one of those conversations that it is much more fun face-to-face. So I'm just going to kind of give you some highlights. So basically, you have labor unions that are formed, and you have and it wasn't a new idea necessarily. Pre-Civil War, you have craftsmen. So if you made hats, all of the hatters would come together and form what was called a guild or guild. You have painters who had a painters guild. You had metal workers who formed their own guild, and they were groups of people who were working together to better their businesses. So this idea of working together by craft wasn't necessarily a new idea. The original idea of these labor unions was to fight for better wages, to fight for shorter hours, and one of the big things was child labor. And we don't have time to really, and I should have sort of put some pictures and some things on here, but I think you read about that last week a little bit, was the really terrible child labor that was happening. Without any child labor laws, people began to go on strike because everybody was being mistreated, to be honest. There was a whole lot of laborers who were being mistreated, but especially children. So these guys began to form unions to fight for these things, and from that we have what we now know of as strikes, and I think they were called the same thing then, in that, okay, if none of us goes to work in the feather factory today, they are going to have to pay us more money, because if nobody works, they're gonna be forced to give in to the demands that we have, and the strikes still happen today. Labor strikes, and a lot of times those strikes would turn very, very violent. At one point there was it's called the Pullman Strike of 1894, where, I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure what was so bad about the Pullman railroad cars, but for whatever reason, there was a whole group of workers who, it's called the Pullman Palace Car Company, and the American Railway Union sort of began to work together. The union went to this railroad system, and they refused to work with any Pullman cars. I don't know what they had done to tick them off, but they ticked them off enough that ultimately the president had to call in what's the word I'm looking for? The president had to call in the federal troops to break up this strike because they were interfering with the mail system. And so strikes can be very, very effective sometimes. Now, sometimes they get a very bad name for themselves. One of the union leaders who ultimately at some point goes to jail because he refused to follow some rules, his name was Eugene Debs. He later becomes a leader among the American Socialists. He ultimately runs for president 5 times on the Socialist Party ticket. Unions have always been plagued by socialists and anarchists, is a phrase that you'll hear. And the reality is there's a whole lot of people who believe that these unions were using laborers to attack the free enterprise system and hardworking Americans. I'll be real honest, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about unions. I will tell you that when my husband worked for UPS, he had the option to join the union. You pay dues into the union and then you work together, and he opted out. And at one point there was a strike at UPS, and had he been part of the union, he would have had signed a contract and wouldn't be able to go to work. And if he had violated that contract, he could have gotten in all kinds of trouble. We opted out of joining the union because he wanted to be free to make that choice. And there are people who believe it's a very socialist, a very controlling part of American labor industry, and who absolutely won't have anything to do with it. I kind of don't really know how I feel about it. I haven't studied it a whole lot, but those are strikes, there's labor unions, and we'll keep going. The age of industry brought with it a whole lot of new opportunities. By the end of the century, many middle-class Americans had what only the upper class had dreamed of in an earlier time period. The middle class included most professional businessmen, a lot of skilled laborers. Many of this upper middle class Americans, they were living in large, elegant homes. By the 19th century, many people now owned sewing machines, phonographs, gas lights, bathrooms were a normal thing now inside of a house instead of outhouses. Things like canned food becomes a thing during this time period. Larger and much more efficient ice boxes. Ready-made clothes. You could go to the store and buy ready-made clothes. Things called carpet sweepers, which would have been a first type of vacuum. The invention of the telephone. A housewife can now call a grocer, have a delivery boy bring these needed items to her door, kind of like the first DoorDash. Sorry. Specialty shops become a thing, whereas before you didn't make it, you didn't get it. Now you have specialty shops and chain stores coming into play. It's a place called Woolworth, a 5 and 10 cent variety of stores was a big deal. Just regular department stores are coming into play. Marshall Field, I think it was in Chicago, opens up. So life really begins to change and probably gets a little easier in a whole lot of cases. We also see these new opportunities for women arising. In 1990, Wyoming was admitted to the Union. This is the first state to grant women full political privileges, and that's really what suffrage is. It's the right to vote. Women were still not really voting during this time period. 2 women who began to very openly and effectively lead women's rights movements during this time period were Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Women's suffrage becomes a big jump ahead for women. A lot of changes happen for the education system during this time period. Secondary education becomes a big deal. Usually by the time kids were a certain age, they didn't go to school anymore because they started working on the farm. And the reality is, in a lot of areas, they would go to school around the farming season. And so kindergarten is put into place in St. Louis in 1873. By 1900, nearly 90% of the American people were literate. Now, this was a really huge thing in American history because for so long, so many Americans couldn't read. Higher education becomes a thing. Colleges, we had colleges, but the reality is, Harvard was started very, very early in U.S. history, but it was a seminary, and a lot of the colleges were not affordable for everybody, and they were really mostly in the very beginning, Harvard and Princeton and all of these places were seminaries. So at this point in time, schools are opening that are specializing in law and medicine and business and education. And people are getting their PhDs now, doctors of philosophy, and you just have a much more higher educated society. Education for adults becomes popular. Public libraries and people are traveling around and doing lectures. We have TED Talks now. That's not anything new. People began to tour the country, speaking on numerous topics, educating people, and going from there. And then the last thing I want to talk about is this temperance movement. Now, temperance is the idea of it's anti-liquor, right? And so people from all areas of society become involved in the temperance movement. In 1833, there were about 5,000 local temperance societies, and it just begins to grow. And the idea was that if we could remove alcohol, all of the negative things that begin to happen because of the alcohol would go away. You actually end up with this thing called the National Prohibition Party, which is a political party, and their whole platform is temperance. You have this thing called the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874. A lady named Frances Willard becomes like this most dynamic leader of this organization. And it's just this whole idea of making alcohol an illegal thing. And I think a lot of it, well, I'm not going to even chase that rabbit. So they called it the demon rum because there were so many issues of mistreatment of women and children because of alcoholic men. That's the reality of kind of summed up the temperance movement. It's the idea of making this demon rum illegal.